If the Titanic is going down today, there's a limited number of lifeboats. Is it women and children first, in your view? Joining me today is Dr. Joyce Benenson. She's an expert in primate and human behaviour and has lots of insights into why, in a sense, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Joyce was a professor of psychology, now retired, but is an associate at Harvard University in the human evolutionary biology department. Joyce, hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to talk to you today about human primates predominantly. We might touch on their cousins if that's relevant, which it so often is, but I'm interested to talk in particular about humans as a primate species, differences between the sexes, why they might be there, and touching particularly on intra-sexual competition, so competition within the sexes, competition between females and competition between males. To kick us off, my first question for you is, beyond, let's say, the obvious physical differences between males and females that we're all aware of, are men and women the same?
That's a huge question. I mean, obviously, it depends what you look at and at what level you look. We all breathe. We all have the same, hearts, lungs, and so forth. But there's differences within each of these organs, within each of our cells. There are differences. So you have to, I think, be more precise and, say what I look at is social structure. So I look at social structure in humans. That's how I started. And then I said, wow, why isn't anybody else in humans looking at this? So that's how I got interested in the primate literature. And this semester, I just taught a course on mammals, more generally, social structure. So I think there are important differences between men and women in social structure that have a huge impact on our lives and that many people aren't aware of. So that typically sex segregation begins at age 5, 6 and happens throughout life, as we see in the sexual division of labor. Now, maybe for the first time, men and women are coming together more than ever. And really, there's these various sex integrated groups. And I think there are problems that come from that and advantages too. And so, I can give you a brief overview of what I think are these differences in social structure in humans that mimic in many ways those that I find in chimpanzees. And that's what kind of started my career by looking at those comparisons. But what I think is men are group oriented. They don't form as close bonds. They can form a few very close bonds, but they're much more comfortable having relationships within a larger group, and they're much more comfortable with hierarchies because it's hard to run a group without having a hierarchy, and that a lot of emotional reactions come from being in a group, being in hierarchies, accepting your place, trying to get maybe higher, but at the same time accepting whatever you can attain. And in contrast, I think, women form very, very close dyadic relationships, very important. The emotional support is critical. And it's critical to differentiate between kin and non-kin. So, from forever, female mammals have taken care of their offspring. And being a single mother is really the way it has been for many, for thousands and thousands and actually millions and millions of years. So the first mammals came 200 million years ago. Most females were solitary and they took care of their offspring as single mothers. So obviously you have a lot of things to think about if you're a single mother, and I always start there. And you have to keep an offspring alive and then another one. And depending on how big you are and how long you live, you might be taking care of these offspring for a long time. But regardless, you're taking care of these offspring or grand offspring until you die. So I just don't see how you can compare a male mammal or a male primate or even a male human being to a female, because you have these constraints. And I was starting by saying females form these dyadic relationships. Well, part of what females are doing is forming a close relationship to keep their offspring alive, and we call them children and humans. If you don't do that, the offspring dies. And, if we're talking from an evolutionary perspective about passing on your genes from one generation to the next, if you fail, then that's the end of you. So the ones who succeeded, which is all of us alive now, if we talk about humans, are the ones who were kept alive successfully, and usually by mothers doing predominantly doing the childcare. So it's very hard for me to see the sexes as the same, because there's such different constraints on what life entails. And I know, we have changed the death rate for children from the natural death rate, which is 50%. 50% of your children die. So if you weren't paying attention, all of your energy and time and resources going into keeping your offspring alive, gestating and then lactating, which is very costly, and then keeping an eye on them, and for humans forever, because not only do you take care of your offspring for years and years and years, but even when you go through menopause, then you're expected to take care of your grand offspring. So we're talking about, I always say having a child is like committing suicide, because you can't go back, right? If you want to keep your genes alive, that's it. You have to really, really, really invest for, forever. And of course, things happen to offspring. Their children, they have problems, they don't have problems, they need more milk. If they're nursing, typically males might need more milk than females. And, you have to adjust constantly. So what you have is females forming these very close relationships with their children, with their assistants, those individuals like their mothers or maybe their husbands. That's very unclear, because not all women have husbands, and men are very variable in terms of helping at all. But so you have these close relationships. And then if we're talking about unrelated females in the social structure, getting back to that, I think it's harder to form a relationship with a female friend, just because you have your children and maybe your grandchildren to take care of. So there's a limit on your time, unlike, I think, boys and men who have a lot more free time. So you have that, and then you want oftentimes different things from your friends. So men, I think, really enjoy competing, really enjoy building up one another's skills, really enjoying doing things that would increase their resources and maybe attract more females. And then females are really, really invested in keeping themselves and their children alive. So I find that there's a lot of emotion that occurs between females, which I think is adaptive. I hate it when females are described as overly sensitive. To me, females live longer than males in almost all mammalian species, almost all primates, not everyone, and certainly in humans in almost all countries. So why is that? Well, because females are more sensitive to pain, so they don't get injured, and they're more careful about diseases, and they're more, they get scared faster if there's something scary around that could threaten their survival. And, they get disgusted more easily because that might be poison for themselves or their children. And so we have a very different cascade of effects that come from females taking care of offspring. But it is not the case that there's one primate way that females form social structures. But in humans, I think the social structure resembles that of chimpanzees, one of our closest living genetic relatives. And there you have these groups of males who engage in intergroup conflict. Sometimes it's lethal, and that would be terrible for females to do that, because they might die or their offspring might get killed. So they have to be very careful if they're going to engage in intergroup conflict. So you have these groups of males, and you have these much more individualistic females who need these close relationships with offspring. If you're able to keep up with your own mother, with a mother, and with maybe a good friend who's going to be not a threat to you and who's going to be supportive.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, I concede my opening question was a wide one, but Thank you for answering as you did. Let's pick up on a number of things here. So, looking to play devil's advocate, Joyce, perhaps a sociologist, some sociologists might say, well, hang on, in the modern day, many men are married to the women of their offspring. They may be involved substantially in childcare. They may have time off from work, perhaps particularly in Europe, for example, for when a child is born. They may not have more spare time. Is this arguable because they may be the full-time worker? Mothers obviously can be as well, but particularly when a baby is first born, it's more likely to be the man. Do those social influences on male and female humans, adult humans, men and women, does that break the idea that women will behave and act differently to men?
Okay, so I guess the way I look at something like this, as I look at any mammalian species, as two forces direct behavior. One is phylogeny, right? And that is what's in our brain, what's evolved, with what's biological, what's fairly immutable, at least, in the short term, not, we're not talking about generations of evolution. And the other is local conditions. And I think people would be surprised at how much what you just said applies to any species. It's not just humans. There are species where males are much more taking care of the offspring. And there are species where, for example, the conditions are very harsh. And, there can't be too many offspring produced or they would die. So better to invest in the ones that you've got. So yes, I totally agree with what you said, with what the sociologist said. If you change the local conditions, then you're certainly going to get greater similarities between the behavior of women and men. Now, does that get rid of the phylogeny? No. So if if things go back, or if for whatever reason there's a divorce or whatever, the women are going to be more concerned about the offspring. And if the child gets sick, if anything happens that could change the local conditions, I would say it's going to go back to a norm. It's not going to be just anything that happens. It's not going to be, oh yes, men, if somehow, let's say the woman gets sick or even dies. Let's take an extreme example. Then, you could say, oh, well, the man is just going to become just like a mother, right? That's what's going to happen. I would say that's not what's going to happen. That doesn't work too well. In fact, there's a study in the Lancet, a Canadian study, that suggests single fathers don't live very long. I mean, I was really shocked at this. It's quite amazing data, and I don't know if it's that extreme, but I think that there are strong phylogenetic signals in our brain that bring us back to kind of a way in which men compete for mates more and women are more focused on keeping their offspring alive. So yes, you can put a lot of pressure and change that, and it can be very useful, certainly for women who love to work and want to do something with their lives besides just, getting the food and taking care of their offspring. Because when I think of hunter-gatherers, women work very hard as well as take care of their offspring. So, but if women want to work in the world that we have created, the weird societies, then what you have to do is try to get help from someone. And if there's a husband around, or if there's policy set up to make sure the husband is around as much as possible, it's going to help. I still think when the child gets sick, when there's any kind of stressor on the system, the phylogenetic signals start signaling very loud and clear. And there is this feeling, oh, my child has some kind of, maybe a chronic condition or some kind of disability, or the woman is probably more likely to give up her job and do something, to feel stronger about it. After all, she's the one who's invested in 9 months of gestation and perhaps lactation and, has a lot more invested in a child. It's not so easy to create a child. And yes, you can talk about now, all kinds of artificial means and whether that will change things. And again, I think the local conditions can make a huge impact on it. But I still think underlying it all are these mammalian phylogenetic differences. And in terms of primates, I think we're most closely related to well, chimpanzees and bonobos in terms of genetics, but I think we're more similar to the chimpanzees. So you could say, oh, if somebody attacks your country right now, are the women going to be just as likely as the men to go out and go to the front lines and fight, right? And I would say, no, that's a big stressor, and that there is some kind of phylogenetic signal that says the men are going to do that, and they're going to be as far away as possible from the women and the children to keep those children alive, and that means their genes alive. So both.
So Joyce, if the Titanic is going down today, there's a limited number of lifeboats. Is it women and children first, in your view?
Yeah, people don't realize how much it was the women and children that were saved, and that they really didn't die that much. That's a very good question. What would happen? I would still hope that the children would be saved the most, and then you think who's going to be the best caregiver. It's possible that somebody would sit down and think, well, this father has more experience and the mother's been the CEO, so maybe we should let the father stay alive with the child. I can see the local conditions, but I can tell you that the women would be scared first. So they would be closer to the lifeboats, and they would have their children closer to the lifeboats. And that, I feel, you couldn't overcome that. That women would know it's sinking faster, and they would take defensive action much more quickly. And that, I don't think you're going to get rid of. So they may elbow their way into the lifeboats faster. And that means, then they can have children again if they survive. And so
they may take, that's interesting. I mean, of course, we're talking kind of semi-hypothetical here, particularly when, of course, it wouldn't specifically be the Titanic, but the concept holds. I wonder if women might respond quicker to defend their children per se. Men may respond as quickly to try and respond to the threat to the boat, if you see what I mean. So that the men might be running around the boat trying to plug the holes in the boat. The women might go to the children.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess my key point is that women know the boat is sinking more quickly. So I don't think the men would respond. If you're talking just about that, they're not going to know the boat is sinking until a long time after the women have already, rushed to the lifeboats. So, yeah, I mean, you could say men are better at mechanical abilities, so they might think, how can I prevent this boat from sinking? While the women are making sure all their children are next to a lifeboat and going to be the first ones in. So yeah, I could think that's a little bit mechanical ability, but I think my key point is the men are still drinking and having a good time while the women are next to the lifeboats. That's what I don't think you could change very easily. That's really, really basic phylogeny.
Would you, a more controversial question, regardless of who's positioned themselves best to get onto the lifeboat, putting that aside, let's imagine you have wardens who are selecting who goes onto the lifeboat, regardless of the location of the civilians on the boat. The children get on the lifeboat. Who else, in your view, should go on the lifeboat? I mean, let me put it another way. Without knowing anything more about the individuals, would you prioritize, this is a leading question, would you prioritize women on the lifeboats because at the end of the day, they do more or maybe are better at looking after the children who are on the lifeboats and are hopefully going to live, be on the lifeboat and live a life and need a parent? Is it then socially, morally acceptable in that horrific situation to prioritize women over men for the lifeboats?
That's a really difficult situation because, again, the local conditions make all the difference. You could have fathers that are just better at parenting, so if you really knew everything, you're omniscient, and, you could say, oh, well, this father should go, this mother really is not so into her kids. But if, on average, I would say that women are more concerned about their kids' well-being. Now, you could have other reasons. You could say, this guy is, a great surgeon. This, anybody could be a great anything. This woman is terrific CEO, or I don't know, whatever, an environmental company. So there's so many things that you could think about that would change the exact calculus of who you save. So I'm not going to say, oh, women are always the best at, taking care of this particular child. And certainly as children grow up, boys learn a lot from their fathers if there are fathers around. So, older children. But obviously, if you have a child who is breastfeeding, if we still have that, and we do, or if there's a shortage of formula, which we've had here in the United States, so, during the pandemic, then, and you have, the children have to eat or they're going to die. So if you care about keeping the children alive, now you might say, we don't want any children. All right, well, let's just keep the men. There's all kinds of things that you could say. But if you care from an evolutionary perspective about passing on your genes, you want the children. And if you care about, on average, who's going to invest the most and who has to invest the most in very little children, particularly in the ancestral environment, then it has to be women, right? Because they're the only ones that breastfeed. And if you care about who really is going to be there for the longest in terms of investing in grandchildren, it's women. So using that kind of ancestral phylogenetic lens, there's no question it's women. But of course, there are local differences. We're all different people. We all have strengths and weaknesses and so forth.
Good. You mentioned women living longer than men. Yes, that's statistically very clear. And of course, it will vary between societies and even within countries to some degree. But we're talking 3, 4, 5 years, something like that. So it's substantive. Yeah. You mentioned, and I know you said this before, actually, your feeling is that that women actually just take care of themselves better, and across a lifespan and across a population that can add up to a few extra years. That could be true, and of course there's the famous idea that that men don't go to the doctors when they should. An alternative explanation is that men are designed to live a bit less long, live fast, die young, just a little bit, just by a few years, because, well, there's a trade-off between burning the candle a bit more brightly and burning out a bit faster if you do so, versus burning the candle a little less brightly and lasting a bit longer. It might seem reasonable a priori to imagine that men and women might have different optimal lifespans. So it may be at least partly to do with that. That actually it's a kind of it's biologically built in. Of course, the kind of the behaviors and the inbuilt biology, of course, are not separate. So if men just have slightly shorter lifespans because life is slightly less valuable to men than to women, and also so they therefore behaviorally care a little bit less, which exacerbates the fact that anyway they're innately built to live a little bit less time. I mean, that's a simple way to put it. I mean, does that sound reasonable to you, or do you feel it mostly comes down to, on average, less effective self-care?
Okay, so I totally agree with your explanation, which at bottom is that men need to compete to mate, that there are fewer men who mate relative to women, and so there's more pressure to do all kinds of risky things and find a mate. I mean, that's what the argument is for, right, all the phenomena that you have described, taking risks, right, being more likely to endanger one's life over and over. So I think that's certainly part of it, but I would argue that women's immune systems is not just their behavior, it's not just self-care. Women's immune systems are stronger. I mean, for almost every disease, not every single one, but almost every single one. Women are less likely to die from cancer at a certain age, any age, less likely to die from anything, not anything, but almost anything. So the immune system of women, despite the riskiness and the lack of self-care of men, is just stronger. And so I think you also probably get a lot of diseases where the immune system overreacts and causes some types of chronic health problems, conditions, I guess, for women that are really, really difficult. So I think it goes both ways. You have what you're talking about is something I somewhat avoided, and that is that male mammals, their number one restriction on being able to pass on their genes is finding a mate, because women or female mammals are limited insofar as many of them are not in estrus. So whether they're gestating or they're lactating or they're seasonal breeders or whatever is the reason, men really have a lot more pressure on them to compete, and that leads to the kinds of things that you're talking about, a lot of increased testosterone, which reduces the functionality of the immune system and causes all kinds of negative effects. So I think that's part of it, but I think there's more than that, and I really do think that from before birth, prenatally, female fetuses die less than male fetuses. And at every single age you look at, you get the same thing. So I don't think it's just due to, this mating drive. Now, we don't know, and I can't argue with you because this is a very interesting, to me, point of contention that will let us learn a little bit more about, sex differences, and particularly to me about diseases that affect men and women differently. And there are tons of them. And to me, that's another reason I think understanding sex is so important. And this is stupid now because I've said it so many times, but I always start with the A's and say, okay, let's take some diseases. And I always think of what are the diseases that start with A? Autism, right? And that affects males more than females. Autoimmune, and that affects females more than males. ADHD, and that affects males more than females. These are not little differences. They're huge differences, very huge. So why do we have these huge differences? And why aren't we saying sex is so important to me? Why aren't we saying that if we're trying to help people to feel better? Because there are huge differences in the types of conditions or diseases or illnesses, whatever you want to call it, that men and women suffer from. And you can see the beginnings of this in childhood, and it certainly gets stronger if you take A's anxiety. That just bubbles up in females, starting in adolescence. So there are huge differences that affect men and women differently. And to me, it's a real shame that people can't say, yeah, okay, we want women to have these opportunities and we want to really admire men for what they do, but there are these huge sex differences that exist and in the way our lives go, and it's not just local conditions that are going to get rid of them.
And finding into those interesting comparisons in terms of risk of disease and susceptibility to diseases and conditions between men and women is the fact that until recent times, at least, the vast majority of clinical research was conducted on men. And I think there's a number of reasons why that was. I'd be interested in your thoughts, first of all, on why. So the list I can come up with off the top of my head is, one, it was young men who were around at universities where a lot of this work was done, because up to a certain point in time, women weren't going to university, at least in no significant numbers. So there's men that were available. Secondly, aside from that, it might be young men are more likely to put themselves forward for clinical trials because on average, they're slightly happier to take risk. Thirdly, a clinical trial might restrict to males because of the risk of affecting a female pregnancy. Fourthly, and this comes back to my very first question, which I don't want to take us back to, but just alluding to that, is to some degree there's been a sense, has there, in society, that men and women are basically the same, apart from a bit of plumbing and so forth. And that therefore, why not take men who are kind of a bit simpler because they're not going to get pregnant and just examine men, and we can extrapolate from men to women, just maybe factor in a difference in mass, job done. What do you think about that? There's four, I think, sorry, you may not recall them all, but I think there's four reasons as to why. I'm not saying any of them are right or wrong, and it certainly isn't ideal that women have been underrepresented in medical studies, of course, but there's a number of reasons why, until at least recently, I think it's been very much predominantly men who have been studied.
So what I think is it's not isolated to humans. It's true with all mammals. Mostly males are looked at, not females. And I think the number one reason is because of menstruation, that the idea was, oh, well, you're having cycling hormones, and that is going to mess up our data. And so therefore, we're going to go with the males because they're more stable. And, one can laugh about that a lot because, males have a big fight and they're injured and that's not so stable. But nonetheless, I think the number one reason is that. And, so what happened is it's a simpler model and you don't want to have to double your sample sizes. And though that to me is the reason. And in fairness, I think it's a terrible thing because women now, if you go to the hospital and you have a heart attack, you're more likely to die because they've spent so much time just using men, if you're talking about humans now, as a model. And the surgeries and the drugs work better for men. So, that's a big problem. On the other hand, men do die earlier than women. And that's not to say women don't suffer longer and much longer than men. So both are needed. But I can imagine, if you're working in the hospital and you have a man and a woman come in, all else equal, the man's more likely to die. So it could kind of focus your attention more. Oh my gosh, doesn't mean the woman isn't suffering horribly and you have no idea what to do until you say, oh, it's hysteria or whatever crazy thing. And that just infuriates me. But nonetheless, men are more likely to die. So that always captures one's attention. But in the end, I think it's a very simple reasoning, and it really is the menstrual cycle.
So Joyce, so far, I feel that you've explained the reason for sometimes quite clear, on average, differences between men and women on the different requirements of them in terms of child rearing and in terms of passing on their genes. And if you think about it carefully, if we think about the way actually modern men and women operate, and our close primate cousins, perhaps particularly the chimpanzees, we can see that men and women are acting very differently with and around their children, and because of that, we would expect a number of other behaviours and attitudes to be somewhat different as well, because males and females are operating different strategies. I know in your work you look quite a lot at intra-sexual competition, so competition within females, between females and between males. What is intra-sexual competition? Is it the majority of between-person competition that we see? I suppose perhaps would be my first question. And I mean, is it intra-sexual competition that describes most of the competition between people? And how does that affect or create differences between men and women?
Okay, so I think for any mammalian species, competition is primarily within the same sex, and humans included, because men and women typically have different goals. And so it doesn't make sense to compete for something you don't want. It's what you want. So if we take men, what are men competing for? As I said before, the variance in reproductive success is higher for males and for men than it is for females, including women. So therefore, men do not pass on their genes if they don't get to mate. And that can lead to some pretty serious competition, and oftentimes, not oftentimes, but much more often than females, death. So in other words, if males think that they can impress a female or they think they can get rid of a rival male, they are willing to sometimes go too far. And you have higher homicide rates, or universally among males than females. So that's extreme competition. But you also get something else with males, and I find that that's competition to be part of a group. And people oftentimes don't think of it like that. So, men really admire other men at the same time. And that's what a lot of my research has shown. And certainly I've seen with children, and it's been reported, around the world. Little boys like to say, who can jump highest, who can make the best paper airplane, who can, run fastest, whatever it is. And they're very good at saying, yeah, you're right, you're better at that, but hey, I'm better at this. And there's this tremendous sense of belonging, I think, of being part of the group and ranking yourself, even if you're not top. So there is competition for mates, which can be lethal and certainly is very serious because you don't achieve, you're out of it. And there's competition to be part of a group. And that's really important too, because that keeps your community alive if there's some kind of disaster, whether it's warfare or, fires or, any kind of natural disaster or conspecifics who are attacking. So that's male kind of competition.
And yeah, if I can just, thank you. So just before I think I'm going to move on to the women. Oh, have I still got you there? I do. Sorry, I lost you for a moment there. You're back. I'm back. Just going back to the men. So there's competition between men in terms of access to females, up to the point in extremis of killing off that guy is in the way. I mean, that's it, extreme scenario, but it makes the point. Isn't it also the case, however, that to some degree men will band together and help each other, maybe physically band together, sometimes just emotionally help each other to seek mates? I mean, wingman being the phrase that perhaps sums that up. So they might compete, but they might also help each other. Also, is there some advantage? So for men, there's in principle the opportunity for them to mate with a lot of women. Is it the case that ideally a man would exclude other men from mating, because the less other men are mating, the more that man has women to himself? Or is there a limit to that? Is there actually perhaps, I don't know if there's an answer to this, but if there is, you may have it. Is there actually an advantage to men to having other men around them who are also being successful to some degree? Anyway, so a couple of reasons why, while men may like hierarchies and like competing against each other, actually in certain situations, they're actively helping each other to be reproductively successful.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you talk about local conditions. Well, let's put all the conditions in place so that fathers will help the mothers. And then, men really have very little reason to compete because everybody's monogamous. Well, let's take the local conditions where there's polygyny, which happens all over the world. So there you have a whole different set of local conditions where men are set up to exclude all men and, take as many wives as they can. But, and this is very important, a bunch of men could always take over a polygynous man's harem, right? And so there's a huge advantage to having subordinate males, what mammalian researchers call satellite males, and you might have them have a few matings and they're going to help you. I mean, old days, there were these eunuchs, right? And castrated men who absolutely wouldn't infringe on your mating rights, but there's a lot of reasons to have men who even can infringe on your mating rights. And I do think part of the bonding of men includes, helping the members of their group find mates and being fairly egalitarian, which is very contradictory. And I think it's hard for people to assimilate the fact that men are so competitive, but also so cooperative. And I do think men help one another, and particularly in monogamous society where there's no advantage to having more than one female. That's not totally true, but you're not supposed to if you want to get along with the other men. But even in a polygynous society where one man, people think, oh wow, he just can keep all these women for himself. No, you have to have a lot of men supporting you to allow you to keep all these women for yourself. You have to. It doesn't make any sense. And that's true in gorillas, and that's true in chihuahuas, and that's,
So even a silverback gorilla, the famous silverback gorilla, is allowing or accepting that some of the satellite males will have some mating opportunities to keep them sweet, to keep them on his side. Otherwise, that although he's the biggest male, physically the biggest, a group of them would overpower him. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. Okay, and so that could be the explanation as to why men aren't entirely ruthless, that actually they are sometimes nice to each other in situations of mating opportunities. Or
I find men are very nice to each other. I mean, I find men get along in many instances much better than women do. So, I don't I don't hew to the stereotype that men are agentic and women are communal at all. I think men are very communal. And I think in some ways women can't be communal. So, I really feel strongly that we have to be more nuanced, and that there's a lot of information now that people are ignoring about competition and cooperation in men, and then thinking about it differently in women. So if I go on then to women, most female mammals originally were solitary. And when I say that, people get really confused because, oh, women are so cooperative and women are so bonded and so forth. And I'm like, well, that's not how we started out, evolutionarily wise. And if you look at chimpanzee females, there are some communities where they might have a best friend for life. But there's many communities where they are by themselves and they're single mothers. And then there's other communities where if you can manage to stay there your whole life, we call that philopatry, then you can be supported by your mother, and they do the best of all. So when you think about what a woman has to figure out when she's growing up, and then as she goes through the rest of her life, you want to keep your children alive. So what's the best strategy to do that? And it depends on the local conditions, but usually the best strategy is if you are married to a man who gives you resources, you want those resources. He may not take care of your children, but it really is advantageous to have those resources. Now you can say, okay, but if the local conditions change and you can get the resources yourself, sure, then you can pay somebody to take care of your children. But in most environments, you are the one who's taking care of your children. And having a man there, given men strategies of trying to mate with as many females as they can, because there is an advantage to that. And if they can get away with it, you want to make sure that doesn't happen, because you don't want to divert the man's resources from you if he's your husband or he invests in you. So therefore, as many men as you can, and this is women's perspective, you want to have investing in you and your children, and that will help keep them alive. And that's clear. More resources, more able to stay alive, more likely to pass on your genes. But who is going to help you with the situation of keeping your husband? Well, female friends are maybe not the most reliable source, because they have an advantage of getting the man's resources too, if they can. And particularly single female friends, I'm not sure that they respect as much as single male friends respect the marital bond. I'm just not sure, because women have to be really careful. They have a lot to lose if they lose a man's resources in most environments. But who can help you if you're a female with your children? Well, your female kin, because they share the same genes that you have and that your children have, and so they would be much more reliable sources. So it's really clear that a mother's mother, the grandmother to her children, can have a huge survival benefit for her children if she's around and willing to invest. So here you are, you're a woman, you've got children, you're maybe even working too, and certainly ancestral women were finding food and working, right, as we would talk about it. And now you've got several children. Now, who's going to help you the most? Well, a husband, your female kin, and now you're overwhelmed, in my opinion. So how is it that you're going to spend time with female friends? Why should you do that? And I can see a situation where well, your children are doing really well and your mother is maybe not close by, and you're secure in your husband. Okay, now you're going to have some time to, get some, and I do think this is true, get some emotional support from a female friend who's in the same boat as you. And that's nice. But you want to be careful with your time, with your investment, with your resources, because you need individuals who are investing in your children. And why should a woman with children of her own invest in your children? I think it doesn't make sense. There was a really interesting article I found in the New York Times yesterday or the day before talking about mommunes, which is the idea of mothers with children, without husbands, without female kin, living together in the same household. And that's a really interesting thing that I thought about a lot, because why don't women do that, right? Some could work, some could take care of the kids. You don't need to deal with a man, if you don't have kin around, great idea, right? The problem is here you've got now not just 2 or 3 or 4 kids to take care of, but who knows how many if you have several single mothers together. And then you have disease spread, and you have disabilities, and you have huge amount of chaos, right? Because that's what little kids are like. And so the question is, how do you manage? And I think that's probably difficult. I mean, there have been studies of this that show typically in polygynous families, it's better for a woman to have her sisters as her co-wives as opposed to unrelated women. And it's better to live in separate houses than in the same house, just in terms of survival, which is kind of the bottom line. And so if this is really true, and I admit there's not enough studies, but there are some, and I can cite them, then you have to think, okay, a woman, and I think competition is different when we think about competition for women and men. Competition for men is a contest. Who's better than who? And it can be extreme. It can cause injuries and cause death. Women don't do that. They might poison one another's children or something like that. That would be the most extreme. But generally, that is not how women compete at all. So it's much more subtle. It's much more quiet. It's harder to see. It's more solitary. It's like going off and doing something on your own and not telling anyone else about how well you're doing. And that's very common. And it's about cloaking competitive urge in sweetness and light when it's not meant to be like that. So it's a very different style of competition and a safer style. And I just argue so that women don't threaten their survival. They don't get into direct contests.
So, okay, that's very interesting. Of course, so could one consider women's intra-specific competition and cooperation in 2 phases of their, let's say, adult lives or reproductively active lives before having children and once they have children? So before having children, they're going to be competing for the attention of the right men. And once they had children, then they're going to want the best environment they can to bring up their children. It would be interesting to know whether, well, you've alluded to this, there may be some work on looking at the survival prospects of children who are brought up in tight communities, very tight communities, or perhaps predominantly female-only communities. I mean, it would be interesting to know, for example, whether you have, 5 mothers and 10 children, right? Each mother, the mother of 2 of those children, whether their responses to the children falling over or needing a nappy changed, or whatever, differs depending on whether that child is theirs or not. I mean, if they buy into responding in the same way to all of those children, because everyone's bought in equally, fine. If it's the case that they don't do that, whether it's conscious or not, that actually they respond differently and preferentially when their actual child out of those 10, their children are actually struggling, when they respond differently and better, then the system's not going to work very well. And then you would imagine that women would seek female support from kin who are more likely to be predisposed to caring for their children because of the genetic connection. I mean, I guess there isn't that much work on those areas to know, but we can look at societies and female mothers' preferences. Do they tend to prefer to get support for childcare from their sisters, from their aunts, from their mother, or do they prefer to get it from their single, or at least, well, no, not necessarily single, but anyway, their non-kin friends? I mean, is that known? Is it known if there's a preference shown by women in that situation?
To me, it's like totally clear, and I could be wrong. So exactly what you said, I don't think has been looked at, but I can give you, certainly you can look at, there's a lot of data on polygynous households, but the idea that a woman would care as much about other children that are not her own as her own makes zero sense to me. That I just can't see that happening ever. I mean, here are children in who you gestated, you lactated, you're there with them day and night, 24 hours how could you possibly care for other children as much? And what would that genetically do to your genes?
Unless the other mothers reciprocated the same amount, right? So if everyone was equal on this and everyone treated those children equally well, you've got many eyes looking after those children. If everyone buys into it, I don't see why not. I would argue that the problem would be some of those mothers may not, right? So they're giving less than the others, and they're then taking more. Okay, it's sort of a game theory situation, I guess, where the other mothers are treating all these 10 children the same.
Exactly. It's a game theory situation. Yeah, it's a game theory situation, and I think it would fall apart really, really quickly. Very, very quickly. It's too much. Your child gets hurt, right? They do. Children get hurt all the time, and you're going to be really worried. You're going to be really scared. They need to go to the doctor or whatever. You can pay attention to anyone. I just don't see how, and certainly there's data on polygynous households, and even data from, I think, Finland, and where they're looking at mothers who are unrelated living together. But I think one of the big points you brought up is philopatry, and I think that's really important. The idea that females spend oftentimes not as much time in their natal community as males in humans. So different species have different patterns where females will spend their whole life in their natal communities, surrounded by female kin, or males will spend their whole life in their natal community surrounded by male kin. And those are huge, to me, factors that now I'm starting a study on that here in Canada, because I think it's so critical to understand and has not been studied. But to me, if you're surrounded by female kin, you can have friends of your natural line, but you're surrounded by aunts and grandmothers and so forth. And so there's a huge advantage, and almost everybody's related to you in some way or another, or friends with somebody who's related to you. There's huge advantage, but I think generally, at least that's what the archaeological record is showing more and more now, when they're digging up these graves and able to, sequence the DNA, that men are philopatric. So women don't have that. So you get women who are off without female kin around. They're in their husband's families, or even if they're neo-local, they're not in anybody's family. You're surrounded by unrelated females. You have this husband then you're really dependent on for your connections to the community, or neither of you are in a great shape. And then the man, the husband, is really, really important to you. It's really critical you don't lose him. And females are, because we know men are always looking for mates, females are threats that are really, really serious. They're not competing just for a mating opportunity like men would be. They're competing for somebody who's going to invest in them and their children for the rest of their lives. That's huge. So I think it's a very different, totally asymmetrical situation for men versus women.
Going back to women before they've got children, so they're single women, they haven't got children to look after, they're seeking a suitable mate. Isn't it the case that a group of women will choose their outfits or whatever it is, look attractive, and present themselves, or go to events? In the modern day it might be the bar or whatever, but present themselves at events where they anticipate suitable men being, and hope to get some interest, and then hope that they can select a suitable one if there's more than one male one man showing them interest. Is there anything more? So women go to the bar, let's say, and try to outcompete how physically attractive they look. Is there anything more to intra-sexual competition in women than that?
Well, I mean, I think if you're just talking about modern society, single women, who have plenty of food and have a home and all that's what you see. But if you're talking about ancestral or even hunter-gatherers or societies today that are non-weird, right? Non-Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, there's a lot more, because you need resources, you need a territory, and I'm talking about human females as mammals, right? You need real estate, you need a place to live, you need all kinds of things. Some of those are given by men. So in which case, yes, the marriage is really, really important. Sometimes though, you're taking care of your little area. Maybe it's, where your family has their house and you're planning to stay there for the foreseeable future anyway. And so you have everything is at stake. And in some sense, the situation you described for women is even more intensified for men, if we're talking about single men, because women are much more likely to find a mate or more, if we're talking about sneaky mating, but men are less likely to. So they are also competing like crazy for women. I do think men traditionally and maybe evolutionarily have competed for these groups, and these groups can be cooperative and competitive all the time, constantly changing, very fluid. So you get the two things, and maybe that offsets a little bit what you're describing in women. In other words, with women, I'm not sure how much cooperation is helpful between single women other than emotional support, which is, as we know, having others around is very helpful. But for men, I do think traditionally there has been a lot of group activity. We're talking about men who join the military, for example, in any nation or in a hunter-gatherer society where there are all kinds of attacks still, as we know now with Ukraine and Russia, right? This has not gone away. It's hard for us to, I think, acknowledge that this is a part of who we are, but it clearly is, and it's been going on, for millennia. So, we have the competition for mates, which is true for both sexes, and I would say even stronger for men than for women, trying to impress the women and constantly doing that, but also maybe a little bit compensated for by the advantage of cooperation from the groups. But for women, you have that what you described. It's absolutely true. I would say it doesn't totally go away after you find a man and get married, because marriage doesn't last forever. For other societies, divorce is really common. And, even obviously in Western societies, it varies based on the local conditions, how common, divorce is. But, I think there's a lot of evidence that women might gain from having some extramarital affairs, I guess we call it. But, certainly in non-human mammals, having several mates is advantageous to females overall. There's a strong advantage. So even after forming a pair bond in humans, I think there might be advantage for women to continuing to seek other mates, or at least having sex with some other men. It diversifies one's genes. There's all kinds of things that might be advantageous in terms of putting one's genes with another individual's genes and not just one individual, because maybe it works better with another man. So I think these things are really not understood. I love this field because I think it's so wide open. And given I have immersed myself since I started studying human children, immersed myself in the primarily primate, but also now mammalian literature, I see, my gosh, how can we even think that men and women don't have different goals and different strategies for getting to those goals, and different health outcomes and different things that affect our lives every single day.
So Joyce, switching tact a bit, but moving on from what you've just said there, building from that, would you be prepared to comment on issues in the modern day? Society is very keen for all groups, or most groups, whatever, to be doing well and to not be held down, and for opportunities for all, which is, broadly speaking, a good thing, of course. But is there some misfiring going on where governments, societies, institutions, individuals look for or seek to generate a society that is ever more supposedly fair and equal? We could debate what equal means, but looking to do that, but with the implicit assumption that men and women behaviorally and in their perspectives and outputs are the same. You've argued eloquently that that's not the case, that on the average they're quite different. Are there ways in which modern society, in trying to do the right thing, is actually misfiring? Maybe making things worse for one of the sexes or both of the sexes, or not taking advantage of the proclivities of one of the sexes, or just engaging in attempts to equalize situations, not realizing that if everything was reasonable, they wouldn't be the same, because men and women aren't the same.
So you're talking about how do you set up the proper local conditions, right? And this varies, of course, all over the world, what kind of societies one should set up. So, of course, I mean, you can look at the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they think they're doing the right thing, right? Because they think women should be home with the children and not ever go out and not have any education, right? They think that's the best thing to do for their reasons, right? And now the opposite maybe is what you're describing in some weird societies where there's no differences between the sexes, and one should ignore the fact that there are you know, any slight discrepancies. And that's the other extreme, right? And it kind of makes me laugh because usually extremes don't work. Doesn't make that much sense. Obviously, there's very many individual differences. And I think, you know, people are realizing that everybody's different. And even within the same sex, you know, to me, sex is, it's a prototype, right? Where you generally, if you're talking about a female, get these things that go together, but not all of them. And same generally for a male. And so people pick this up and they think, oh, but look at this, you can take this one thing and see, oh yeah, you can have, you know, testicles if you're a woman who has a, you know, the wrong sex component of genes. And you know, you can do all kinds of things which don't fit. And so people get all upset and say, oh, there's no such thing as sex because look at these exceptions, right? So then you get into what is a woman, what is a man, and it's to me a real big mess. But it's, from my perspective, very simple when you don't look at humans and you don't look at local conditions. There's one sex now that has offspring and the other sex doesn't, and the brain has evolved to make that so that the sex that has offspring thinks differently about the offspring than the sex that doesn't have to bring up the offspring. And yeah, I think that's really true. Of course, no government is getting it all right, and there's huge numbers of differences between the local conditions. And you know, you can go from Afghanistan to, you know, some societies now where they're saying there's no sex differences. What can you say, right? We're trying, everybody's trying, you know, I'm sure the Taliban could get on here and make their argument for why that's the best way to do things, right? And it seems shocking to us. And then it does seem, you know, a little shocking to me when people say, oh, there's no differences between men and women. You know, that seems shocking to me too, which is kind of what you alluded to. So yeah, that doesn't make sense. But, you know, I think, I don't know, I would like to say that people are trying to do the best they can. Obviously, I agree with some people a lot more than other people, so it's hard to get that, you know, out of one's head. But what can you say? What leads to local conditions around the world? There's so, you know, why should there be polygyny versus why should there be monogamy? You know, there's so many things that are local conditions, and it's true for non-humans. It's the same thing. They don't have a government that says you should do it this way or that way, but there's many. People don't realize across communities of the same species, animals form different ways of doing things, different types of mating systems, different types of phylopatry, different, you know, different same-sex relationships. So one looks at the local conditions one's born into, and if you, as long as you're in that condition, you try to figure out what's the best strategy to deal with it. And what I like is the idea that people are agentic, both women and men, both sexes, not just men. And we try to figure out what's the best thing to do. Here I am, what do I do so things are best for me? And part of that decision making, I think, that gets left out is, from an evolutionary perspective, what's the best way to survive and to mate and to keep up my offspring's life so they can also pass on their genes.
You're right that probably most people most of the time are trying to do the right thing and help society. These days in the West, at the moment, there are strong activist groups and militant groups who have very clear opinions about how society should be, and, you know, the differences or lack thereof of differences between the sexes and so forth. I mean, you're very much an academic. your work is very, very interesting. It's available, a lot of it's available to the masses via Google Scholar and so forth. Maybe some bits are behind paywalls based on the journal's decisions, I'm not sure, but it's out there. Have you found that as an academic worker, you're left alone to just find the answers? Or have you found, or have you been at all victim to activists finding you and picking up on some of the statements that you've said or written?
Pretty much, I have to say I've been left alone. The people who, are interested in my work have a particular reason. Either they're an academic, like yourself, who's, a researcher, or, maybe they're interested in, for political reasons, trying to understand what is my background. But generally, I have been left alone. I'm not well known. I love what I do. I feel free to do it and to ask the questions that I want to ask. I would be very upset if people said, you can't ask those questions. That would be horrible. And I do find it very strange that when people say there's no sex differences, and women have tried so hard to create organizations to look at, for example, women's health. So there's several organizations in the United States that I know of that are just devoted, they're top women doctors, to understanding women's health, because so much, as you said before, medical research has been focused on men's health. So it's wonderful that we have these organizations devoted to looking at women's health. When women come along and say there are no sex differences, I'm thinking, do you know how hard we fought to get these organizations going so that we could understand and receive some kind of parity in terms of funding and understanding? So that to me is a major contradiction. It doesn't make sense, and I do find that women are getting, very upset about the differences between men and women, which doesn't make sense to me. On the other hand, then you have men who are trying to say, oh, well, we're superior to women and women should be in the home. And that's not good either, right? And there needs to be an understanding that women have for so many years not had the status that men do. Of course, if you look at non-humans, oftentimes that's the case. Males are, as I call it, the trifecta. They're bigger and they're faster and they're stronger than females. And so what do you do about that? You can't make that go away. That's the way it is. And you have to accept that. And so therefore, I think women are like really taking a chance if you want to go head to head with a man who has a size, strength, and speed that you don't have. And when it comes down to a contest, you are going to lose. There's almost no women who are going to win. And so there is something to saying, okay, men have these advantages, or you refer to the Titanic, they have these mechanical, abilities. Some women have them, but generally not many compared to the top men. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about looking at what's accurate, respecting the differences of each sex, and then, trying to create local conditions that would benefit both sexes, without denying the reality. But I pretty much, go under the radar, and I really enjoy that because it gives me the freedom to look at what I'm interested in.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, going under the radar, particularly this sort of work, is very helpful. So I hope it will continue to leave you alone to get on with it, whilst you continue to get the credit you deserve for some very, very interesting work. Joyce, I could talk with you literally all day on this. There's so much that could be covered. Very, very interesting. Of course, I've taken a look at your Google Scholar page on a good few occasions, actually, where your papers are presented. And I mean, the titles are very, very enticing. We didn't get a chance to talk about some of your latest work, but I would encourage people to put your name into Google Scholar. Is that the best place, Joyce, for people to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book that kind of summarized all my work about 10 years ago called Warriors and Worriers. And I still feel that kind of, I obviously I've done a lot in the last 10 years and expanded on that, but I kind of feel that puts together my view of sex differences. It doesn't talk about diseases. Maybe sometime I'll update it. It doesn't talk about all the ramifications, but it does talk about why boys and girls segregate, because they like to do different things early on in life all over the world, in other species. So if that's the case, you have to argue that there's these, brain mechanisms that have evolved to allow that to happen for the benefit of males and females. And so I would say that's it. And then of course, Google Scholar, it gives the, all of my publications, but some of the ones that I haven't talked about.
Warriors and Warriors, yeah, excellent. People, I recommend people looking for that book that summarizes many of your thoughts for now. Joyce, thank you so much for joining me. I hope we can speak again in the future.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, Lewis. Okay.